Jake Morrison had been causing trouble at the Galactic Military Academy for exactly 6 months and 12 days. He knew this because Commander Veltar reminded him every single morning during inspection. The tall, gray-skinned Zenthari officer would stand in front of Jake's bunk and announce to the entire dormitory how many days the human had been disrupting their perfect order. The other cadets would stand at attention, while Commander Veltar delivered his daily speech about proper military conduct. The Krillian warriors, with their thick purple skin and forearms, never moved a muscle during these lectures. The Vexani, pale and thin with large black eyes, would listen with their minds instead of their ears, sharing thoughts through telepathy. Even the few other species represented at the academy maintained perfect discipline, everyone except Jake. This morning was no different. Jake stood beside his perfectly made bed, trying not to smile as Commander Veltar began his familiar routine. The commander's voice carried across the dormitory like a cold wind. "Cadet Morrison," the commander said, his words sharp and precise. "Yesterday you were caught laughing during combat simulation number 47. The scenario involved the rescue of civilian prisoners from hostile forces. 312 sentient beings died in that simulation. You found this amusing." Jake kept his eyes forward, but his mouth twitched slightly. "No, sir, I found it ridiculous." The dormitory fell completely silent. Even the Vexani stopped their mental chatter. Commander Veltar stepped closer to Jake, his yellow eyes narrowing. "Explain yourself, Cadet." Jake finally looked directly at the commander. The enemy was using the same attack pattern they've used in every simulation for the past month. They positioned their guards in the exact same locations. They followed the same patrol routes. They even made the same tactical mistakes. Any first-year cadet could have predicted their moves and saved those prisoners with 0 casualties. "The simulations are based on real historical battles," Commander Veltar replied coldly. "They represent proven tactical situations that have occurred throughout galactic history." "That's the problem," Jake said. "Everyone in the galaxy knows these historical battles. Everyone studies the same tactics, everyone follows the same rules, so everyone knows exactly what everyone else is going to do." Commander Veltar's skin darkened with anger. The Zenthari were known for their logical minds and perfect military discipline. Questions and challenges were not part of their culture. "These tactics have kept peace in this galaxy for over 3,000 years, Cadet. They have been tested in real combat against real enemies. They work," Jake shrugged. "They work against enemies who fight the same way you do. But what happens when you meet someone who doesn't follow your rules?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. "Commander?" Veltar stared at Jake for a long moment, then turned to address the other cadets. "This is why humans are not suited for galactic military service," he announced. "They question everything. They refuse to follow established procedures. They think they know better than 3 millennia of military experience." After the commander left, Jake's roommate approached him. Cadet Zafira was a Vexani, barely 5 feet tall with skin so pale it was almost transparent. Her large black eyes seemed to see everything, and her telepathic abilities made her one of the top students in their class. "You should not challenge the commander so openly," she said, her voice soft and musical. "He is already looking for reasons to dismiss you from the program." Jake sat on his bunk and began pulling on his combat boots. "Maybe that would be for the best. I don't think I'm cut out for this place." "You scored highest in the class on improvised tactics," Zafira reminded him. "Your physical conditioning scores are excellent. Your weapons training is above average. The only area where you struggle is following orders." "Following stupid orders," Jake corrected. "There's a difference." Zafira tilted her head, a gesture that made her look like a curious bird. "In your culture, is it common to question authority figures?" Jake laughed. "Where I come from, questioning authority is practically a requirement. We have this saying, when in doubt, ask why. Most of our greatest achievements came from people who refused to accept that something couldn't be done. That must make governing your species very difficult." "It does," Jake admitted. "But it also means we adapt pretty quickly when things change. We don't spend a lot of time doing things just because that's how they've always been done." Their conversation was interrupted by the morning alarm. Time for combat training in the holographic simulation chambers. Jake grabbed his gear and followed the stream of cadets toward the training facility. The simulation chamber was a massive room filled with hard light projectors that could create any environment imaginable. Today's exercise was simple. A squad of 6 cadets would infiltrate an enemy base and retrieve stolen intelligence data. The enemy force would be controlled by the Academy's tactical computer, programmed with thousands of historical battle scenarios. Jake was assigned to Alpha Squad along with Zafira, 2 Krillian warriors named Torvak and Hishara, a Xanthari communications specialist called Yelkoth, and a human named Ryan Brooks. Ryan was from Earth's Military Engineering Corps, a quiet young man who followed orders perfectly and never caused trouble. Squad leader Torvak gathered them in a circle to review the mission parameters. The Krillian was massive, even by his species standards, with thick purple skin marked by ritual scars that showed his warrior status. His forearms moved constantly as he spoke, gesturing to emphasize each point. The objective is located in the central tower of the enemy complex, Torvak explained. Standard infiltration protocol calls for a diversionary attack on the main gate while a smaller team approaches from the rear. Yelkoth will handle communications. Hishara and I will lead the frontal assault. Zafira will provide tactical coordination. Brooks will handle any technical obstacles. Morrison will provide covering fire and follow designated routes. Jake raised his hand. What if the enemy isn't expecting a standard infiltration? Torvak's 4 eyes focused on Jake with obvious irritation. The computer is programmed with optimal tactical responses. It will deploy forces according to established military doctrine. Right? Which means it's expecting us to follow established military doctrine too. Because established military doctrine works, Torvak replied firmly. We will execute the mission, as planned. The simulation began with their squad positioned outside a heavily fortified enemy base. Guard towers surrounded the perimeter, and patrol units moved in predictable patterns around the facility. Jake watched the enemy movements for several minutes, noting the timing of their patrols and the positioning of their sensors. Beginning diversionary assault, Torvak announced over the comm system. He and Hishara charged toward the main gate, their weapons blazing. The enemy responded exactly as expected, moving reinforcements to counter the attack. Rear team, proceed to secondary objective, Torvak ordered. Zafira, Ryan, and Yelkoth began moving toward the back of the facility. Jake was supposed to follow them, but something bothered him about the whole setup. The enemy response was too perfect, too predictable. In real combat, wouldn't the defenders be at least a little surprised by the attack? Wouldn't they make some kind of mistake? Instead of following his assigned route, Jake circled around to the east side of the facility. There were no guards posted here because military doctrine said attacks never came from that direction. The ground was rough and provided poor cover for advancing troops. Jake grinned and began climbing. 20 minutes later, he dropped through a skylight into the central tower, bypassed the security systems using techniques he'd learned from breaking into his high school during boring weekends, and retrieved the intelligence data. By the time his squad realized he wasn't following the plan, the mission was complete. The simulation ended with their squad standing in the debriefing room, facing a very angry instructor, Kelthara. The elderly Vexani had been training military cadets for over 2 centuries, and she had never seen anything like Jake's performance. "Cadet Morrison," she said, her mental voice echoing in all their heads. "You abandoned your assigned position. You ignored direct orders from your squad leader. You used unauthorized infiltration techniques. You completed the mission through methods that are not approved by any military manual in our database." Jake nodded. "Yes, ma'am, but I completed the mission with 0 casualties and in half the expected time." "That is not the point," Instructor Kelthara replied. "Military operations depend on coordination and predictability. Your teammates must be able to anticipate your actions. Your commanders must be able to rely on your following orders. What you did today was not teamwork. It was chaos. It was effective chaos." The instructor's large black eyes seemed to bore into Jake's soul. "Effectiveness without discipline is not military service, cadet. It is vigilantism. We do not train vigilantes here." Jake left the debriefing room with another black mark on his record. His fellow cadets avoided him as they walked back to the dormitories. Even Ryan, his fellow human, seemed uncomfortable with what had happened. That evening, Jake found himself alone in the recreation area, staring out at the stars through the Academy's massive viewport. The space station orbited a small moon, and the view of the gala. 3 weeks passed without Jake causing any major incidents. He followed orders during training exercises, kept his opinions to himself during lectures, and even managed to complete an entire week without being called to Commander Veltar's office. The other cadets began to relax around him, and some of the instructors started to believe that the human had finally learned his place. Ryan Brooks was the first to notice that something was different about Jake's behavior. During their evening meal in the Academy cafeteria, he watched his fellow human pick at his food without eating much. "You've been quiet lately," Ryan observed. "Everything okay?" Jake shrugged. "Just trying to stay out of trouble like the commander wants. That doesn't sound like you." "Maybe that's the problem," Jake replied. "Maybe I've been trying too hard to be myself instead of fitting in." Ryan frowned. He had known Jake for months now, and this defeated attitude was completely unlike him. "You're not thinking of quitting, are you?" Before Jake could answer, an urgent alarm began blaring throughout the station. The cafeteria's main screen activated, showing Admiral Korthus standing in the command center. The elderly Xanthari's normally calm expression showed signs of stress. "Attention all personnel," the Admiral announced. "We have received a distress signal from the colony of New Thessia in the Outer Rim. The colony is under attack by Void Hunter raiders. All available ships are being dispatched immediately, but the nearest full military response is 48 hours away." Jake's head snapped up. The Void Hunters were legendary among the Outer Rim colonies. They were nomadic raiders who appeared without warning, captured civilians for the slave trade, and disappeared before military forces could respond. No one knew where they came from or where they went between attacks. "Training operations will continue as scheduled," Admiral Korthus continued. "However, I am authorizing a limited reconnaissance mission to assess the situation at New Thessia. This mission will be led by Academy instructors and will serve as a practical training exercise for senior cadets." The screen went dark, and excited chatter filled the cafeteria. A real mission, even a reconnaissance one, was far more interesting than another simulation. Several cadets immediately began speculating about who would be chosen for the assignment. Jake wasn't thinking about the mission selection. He was thinking about the families on New Thessia, who were probably hiding in their homes right now, hoping someone would come to help them. He was thinking about children who might never see their parents again if the Void Hunters succeeded. An hour later, Jake stood in Commander Veltar's office along with 3 other cadets. Ryan Brooks was there, looking nervous but determined. Lisa Park, a human communication specialist, stood at attention beside him. The 4th member of their team was Yithara, a tall, thin alien with tentacle-like appendages instead of hair. Her species was known for their excellent sensor abilities. "You 4 will comprise the reconnaissance team," Commander Veltar announced. "Your mission is to observe and report on the situation at New Thessia. You will not engage the enemy under any circumstances. You will not attempt any rescue operations. You will gather intelligence and transmit it back to command. Is this understood?" All 4 cadets responded with a crisp, "Yes, sir." Commander Veltar's yellow eyes focused on Jake. "Cadet Morrison, you will lead this mission. Consider it your final test. Follow your orders exactly, and you may have a future in the galactic military. Deviate from those orders in any way, and you will be on the next transport back to Earth." Jake felt the weight of the commander's words. This wasn't just about his own career anymore. If he failed, it would prove that humans couldn't be trusted with real responsibility. It would end any chance for his species to join the galactic community as equals. "Understood, sir," Jake replied. 2 hours later, their small team was aboard the training vessel Neptune's Dawn, heading toward the Outer Rim. The ship was designed for cadet training missions with basic weapons and minimal armor. It wasn't built for combat, which suited their reconnaissance mission perfectly. Lisa Park sat at the communications station, monitoring transmissions from New Thessia. Most of the channels were silent, but occasionally they picked up fragments of emergency broadcasts, families calling for help, colony security forces reporting overwhelming enemy numbers, children crying in the background of desperate messages. "How long until we reach New Thessia?" Jake asked Ryan, who was handling navigation. 6 hours at current speed, Ryan replied. "We should arrive just after dawn local time." Yathara looked up from her sensor console. "I'm detecting multiple ships in the New Thessia system. At least 12 vessels, possibly more. They're too far away to get detailed readings, but the energy signatures match known Void Hunter configurations." Jake stared at the sensor display. 12 ships was a massive raiding force. The Void Hunters usually operated in groups of 3 or 4 vessels. This wasn't just a raid, it was a full-scale invasion. "We need to report this," Lisa said. "Command needs to know the situation is worse than expected." Jake nodded and opened a channel to the Academy. "Command, this is Reconnaissance Team Alpha. We're detecting at least 12 hostile vessels in the New Thessia system. Request permission to move closer for detailed intelligence gathering." Commander Veltar's voice crackled over the communication system. "Negative. Reconnaissance Alpha. Maintain safe distance and observe only. Do not approach the colony. Sir, with respect, we won't be able to gather useful intelligence from this range. The colonists need accurate information about enemy positions and numbers. Your orders are to observe and report, Cadet, nothing more." Jake closed the communication channel and stared at the tactical display. By the time the Galactic fleet arrived, the colonists would already be gone. The Void Hunters would have loaded their prisoners onto slave ships and disappeared into the vast emptiness of space. "Jake," Ryan said quietly, "what are you thinking?" Jake was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his grandfather before leaving Earth. The old man had served in several of Earth's conflicts and had told Jake something that stuck with him. Sometimes doing the right thing means doing the wrong thing first. "I'm thinking our orders don't make sense," Jake said finally. Yathara's tentacles curled with anxiety. "The commander was very clear about our mission parameters. The commander is sitting safely in the Academy while innocent people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery," Jake replied. "How is watching that happen going to help anyone?" Lisa turned in her chair to face him. "Jake, you heard what Commander Veltar said. If you disobey orders on this mission, it's over for all of us. It's over for all humans in the galactic military." Jake was quiet for a long moment. He understood the consequences. He understood what failure would mean for his species, but he also understood what success would mean for the families on New Thessia. "Change course," he ordered. "Take us in closer." "Jake, no," Ryan protested. "We can't risk it." "We can't not risk it," Jake replied. "Those people down there are counting on someone to help them. If we just sit here and watch, we're as bad as the raiders." Yathara's sensor readings showed the Void Hunter ships were moving into orbital positions around New Thessia. The colony's small defense fleet had already been destroyed. Ground-based weapons were being systematically eliminated by orbital bombardment. "They're preparing for a ground assault," Yathara reported. "The colony's shields will fail within the hour." Jake studied the enemy positions on the tactical display. The Void Hunters were following standard raiding protocols. Destroy the defenses, land troops, gather prisoners, and retreat. It was efficient and predictable, which meant it had weaknesses. "Lisa, can you tap into the colony's communication network without being detected?" Lisa's fingers flew over her console. "Yes, but what's the point? We can't tell them anything they don't already know." "We can tell them exactly where the enemy ships are positioned," Jake said. "And more importantly, we can tell them where they're not positioned." He pointed to a gap in the Void Hunter formation. "Look at this. They've got the main population centers covered, but they're ignoring the industrial sector on the colony's north side, probably because there's nothing valuable there to steal." Ryan began to understand Jake's thinking. The industrial sector has maintenance tunnels that connect to the residential areas. If people could get there without being detected, they could hide until help arrives, Jake finished, but they'd need to know exactly when and where to move. "That would require us to coordinate with the colonists," Yathara said. "That's direct involvement in the situation. It violates our orders." Jake looked at each of his teammates. Ryan was clearly torn between following regulations and doing what seemed right. Lisa appeared nervous, but determined. Yathara's tentacles were writhing with stress, but her large eyes showed a spark of something that might have been excitement. "I'm not ordering any of you to do this," Jake said. "But I can't sit here and watch people die when we could help them. If you want to report me to Commander Veltar, I understand." Ryan was the first to speak. "The maintenance tunnels also connect to the spaceport. If we could create a distraction at the right moment, some people might be able to reach the emergency shuttles." Lisa turned back to her console. The trial of Jake Morrison began 2 weeks after the New Thessia incident. The great assembly hall of the Galactic Military Academy had been transformed into a courtroom with representatives from every major species in attendance. Jake had never seen so many different aliens in one place at the same time. The Zenthari delegation sat in perfect rows, their gray skin and yellow eyes making them look like living statues. The Krillian representatives wore their finest ceremonial armor, their forearms folded in ritual positions of judgment. The Vexani observers floated slightly above their seats, their large black eyes taking in every detail while their minds shared thoughts in silence. But the most surprising attendees were the members of the Eldest Council, 3 ancient beings, who rarely left their homeworlds for anything less than a galactic crisis. Their presence meant this trial was about more than just one cadet's disobedience. It was about the future of human participation in galactic affairs. Jake sat at the defendant's table wearing his dress uniform, which felt strange after months of combat gear and training clothes. Beside him sat Lieutenant Colonel Sam Rodriguez, a human military lawyer who had arrived from Earth specifically for this trial. Rodriguez was older than Jake's father, with gray hair and kind eyes that seemed to see everything. "Remember what we discussed," Rodriguez whispered to Jake. "Answer the questions honestly, but don't volunteer information unless I tell you to. The prosecution is going to try to make you look like a dangerous rebel who can't follow orders." The courtroom, Prosecutor Yelkoth was arranging his files with typical Zenthari precision. The tall alien had built his reputation by successfully prosecuting military personnel who violated regulations. He had never lost a case, and he clearly didn't intend to start now. Admiral Corthes entered the courtroom and took his place as the presiding judge. The elderly Zenthari had been Jake's only supporter among the Academy leadership, but even he looked troubled by the situation. "This court is now in session," Admiral Corthes announced. "We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of Cadet Jake Morrison on charges of insubordination, reckless endangerment, violation of first contact protocols, and unauthorized use of military assets." Prosecutor Yelkoth stood and approached the center of the courtroom. His opening statement was delivered with the mechanical precision that Jake had come to expect from the Zenthari. "Honored members of the tribunal," Yelkoth began, "the charges against Cadet Morrison are not merely violations of military protocol. They represent a fundamental challenge to the order that has maintained peace in this galaxy for over 3,000 years. The prosecutor activated a holographic display showing the mission logs from Neptune's dawn. The evidence will show that Cadet Morrison willfully disobeyed direct orders from his commanding officer. Rather than conducting the reconnaissance mission as instructed, he chose to involve himself directly in a combat situation. Jake watched as the display showed their ship's movements during the New Thessia operation. From the outside, it looked like chaos. The ship moved in unpredictable patterns, stopped in unauthorized locations, and maintained communications with planetary surfaces despite orders to maintain radio silence. The defendant's actions placed his team at unnecessary risk, Yelkoth continued. They violated established protocols for dealing with hostile forces. Most importantly, they demonstrated a complete disregard for the chain of command that forms the foundation of military organization. The prosecutor paused and looked directly at Jake. "The defense will argue that Cadet Morrison's actions saved lives, but at what cost? If military personnel are allowed to ignore orders whenever they believe they know better, the entire structure of galactic defense collapses." Yelkoth presented his evidence methodically. Security recordings showed Jake questioning orders during training exercises. Communication logs revealed multiple instances of unauthorized transmissions during the New Thessia mission. Technical data proved that Neptune's dawn had moved far closer to the combat zone than orders permitted. The prosecution's star witness was Commander Veltar himself. The Zenthari officer testified about Jake's long history of disciplinary problems, his refusal to follow established procedures, and his general disruptive influence on other cadets. Cadet Morrison represents everything that is wrong with human military philosophy, Commander Veltar stated under oath. Humans value individual initiative over collective discipline. They prioritize immediate emotional responses over long-term strategic thinking. They are fundamentally incompatible with galactic military standards. When it came time for the defense, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez surprised everyone by not disputing any of the facts presented by the prosecution. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all species," Rodriguez began, "I am not here to deny that my client violated regulations. The evidence against him is overwhelming and accurate. Cadet Morrison did disobey orders. He did involve himself in a combat situation without authorization. He did ignore established protocols." Jake felt his heart sink. His own lawyer was basically admitting his guilt. "But," Rodriguez continued, "I am here to question whether following those regulations would have been the right thing to do. For 3,000 years, your military has operated on the principle that predictable responses lead to successful outcomes. You have created a system where everyone knows what everyone else will do in any given situation." Rodriguez activated his own holographic display, showing tactical analyses of major military conflicts throughout galactic history. This predictability has indeed maintained peace, but it has also created a dangerous vulnerability. Your enemies know your tactics as well as you do. They can predict your responses because you always follow the same patterns. The display shifted to show the New Thessia operation from a different perspective. Instead of chaotic movement, Jake's team's actions looked like a carefully coordinated dance around enemy positions. "What you call insubordination, I call adaptation," Rodriguez argued. "What you call reckless endangerment, I call innovative tactics. My client didn't break your system. He exposed its limitations." Rodriguez called his first witness, and Jake was shocked to see Ryan Brooks enter the courtroom. His teammate looked nervous but determined as he took the witness stand. "Cadet Brooks," Rodriguez said, "please tell the court what happened when you followed standard reconnaissance protocols during the first part of your mission." Ryan's voice was quiet but clear. "We obtained minimal useful intelligence, sir. The enemy was too far away for detailed sensor readings. We couldn't determine their exact numbers, weapon configurations, or tactical intentions." "And what happened when you deviated from those protocols?" "We were able to provide precise intelligence to colony defenders. We identified enemy patrol patterns, predicted their movement schedules, and helped coordinate civilian evacuations. The information we gathered directly contributed to saving hundreds of lives." The prosecution objected, arguing that the effectiveness of the mission was irrelevant to the question of whether regulations had been violated. But Rodriguez had made his point. Following orders would have resulted in a useless intelligence report while civilians died. The next witness surprised everyone even more. Lisa Park entered the courtroom accompanied by a translator, because she was followed by 3 colonists from New Thessia. The aliens wore simple civilian clothes and looked overwhelmed by the formal military setting. The first colonist was an elderly Vexani named Tethara. Through the translator, she described the terror of watching Void Hunter ships appear in their system. Her family had been preparing to hide in their basement when they received an encrypted message with detailed evacuation instructions. The voice on the communication channel told us exactly when to move, which routes were safe, and where the enemy ships were positioned, Tethara testified. "Without that information, my family would have been captured or killed." The second colonist was a young Krillian named Horthak. His 4 arms gestured expressively as he described leading a group of children through maintenance tunnels to safety. Again, the precise intelligence provided by Jake's team had made the difference between successful evacuation and disaster. The final colonist was the most powerful witness of all, a human child named Emma Collins, barely 8 years old. Her family had been among the first wave of human settlers on New Thessia, and she had been born on the colony. Emma looked directly at Jake as she spoke. "The scary ships came and everyone was very frightened. But then the nice voice on the radio told us how to play hide and seek with the bad people. We played the game really well and the bad people couldn't find us. Her simple words carried more impact than any military analysis. This wasn't about regulations or protocols or military doctrine. It was about a little girl who was alive because someone had chosen to help instead of just watch. Prosecutor Yelkoth tried to redirect the focus back to military discipline during his cross-examination. "Witness Collins," he said gently, "do you understand that the people who helped you broke important rules to do so?" Emma nodded seriously. "My mommy always says that sometimes you have to break small rules to follow big rules. The big rule is that you help people when they're scared." Lieutenant Jake Morrison's new office was located in a forgotten section of the academy that had once been used for storage. The room was small, cramped, and filled with outdated equipment that nobody wanted. Jake thought it was perfect. Nobody would bother them here, and nobody would expect anything important to come from such an unimpressive location. His team was just as misfit as their headquarters. Ryan Brooks had requested transfer immediately after the trial, eager to work on projects that actually mattered. Lisa Park joined them a week later, followed by Yathara, who surprised everyone by abandoning her promising career in traditional intelligence work. But the real surprise came when Torvak knocked on their door. The massive Krillian warrior had been one of Jake's harshest critics during their cadet days. But the trial had changed his perspective on many things. "I wish to join your unconventional warfare division," Torvak announced, his forearms folded, in a gesture of formal request. Jake looked up from the tactical manuals he had been studying. "Why would you want to do that? You're already being considered for advanced command training." "Because I have been thinking about what Captain Vasquez said during your trial," Torvak replied. "She spoke about adapting to survive. My people have followed the same warrior traditions for thousands of years, but perhaps it is time to learn new ways of fighting." Within a month, their small team had grown to include representatives from 6 different species. They were all misfits in some way. Soldiers who asked too many questions, officers who had been passed over for promotion because they thought differently, aliens who didn't quite fit into their own culture's military traditions. Jake's first official assignment came directly from Admiral Korthus. The hegemony of Sarkoth, a militant empire from the Galactic Core, had declared war on the Outer Rim Alliance. The hegemony was everything the galactic military understood: disciplined, predictable, and extremely effective at traditional warfare. "Initial battles are going according to established patterns," Admiral Korthus explained during their briefing. "The hegemony fleet consists of heavily armored dreadnoughts supported by fighter squadrons. They advance in formation, engage enemy forces directly, and overwhelm them through superior firepower and numbers." Jake studied the battle reports on his tablet. Every engagement had followed the same basic pattern. The hegemony would arrive, deploy their forces according to standard doctrine, and methodically destroy whatever opposition they faced. It was efficient, brutal, and completely predictable. "What's our role in this?" Jake asked. "The traditional fleet is handling the main battle lines," the admiral replied. "Your team will conduct independent operations behind enemy lines. Harassment, intelligence gathering, disruption of supply lines. Think of yourselves as a testing ground for new tactics." Jake's team spent 3 days studying hegemony battle tactics. Their enemies were so good at traditional warfare that they had perfected it. Every ship movement, every weapon deployment, every tactical decision followed optimal military theory. They never made mistakes because they never deviated from proven strategies. "They're better at our game than we are," Ryan observed during one of their planning sessions. "Their formations are perfect, their timing is flawless, their coordination is absolute." "Then we don't play their game," Jake replied. "We play a different game entirely." Lisa looked up from her communication intercepts. "What kind of different game?" Jake pointed to the tactical display showing hegemony fleet movements. "Look at this. They respond to every situation exactly as military doctrine predicts. They're like a computer program running the same code over and over again." "Computer programs have weaknesses," Yathara added. "If you know how the program works, you can exploit its logic." That gave Jake an idea. Instead of trying to fight the hegemony using traditional tactics, they would turn the enemy's predictability against them. Operation Wildcard began 3 weeks later. The first phase looked like a series of disasters. Jake's unconventional warfare units appeared to malfunction during critical battles. Ships broke formation at crucial moments. Retreat orders were issued when victory seemed certain. Supply convoys took wrong turns and ended up far from their intended destinations. Hegemony commanders, trained to exploit any sign of weakness, moved quickly to take advantage of these apparent failures. They redirected forces to pursue retreating enemies. They repositioned fleets to intercept misdirected supply runs. They adjusted their own tactics to counter what appeared to be incompetent opposition. But every hegemony response was exactly what Jake had predicted. Their enemies were so committed to optimal tactical decisions that they couldn't recognize when those decisions were being manipulated. The trap was sprung during the Battle of Kepler's Gate, a strategic star system that controlled access to 3 major shipping routes. The hegemony fleet arrived expecting to find the traditional galactic defense forces deployed in standard defensive positions. Instead, they found empty space and a single ship, Jake's new flagship, the UES Defiance. The vessel was smaller than a hegemony cruiser and appeared to be completely alone. Admiral Thrackness, the hegemony fleet commander, was puzzled by the situation. His tactical computers indicated that this was either a trap or a desperate last stand. Since his intelligence reports showed no other enemy forces in the system, he concluded it must be desperation. "All ships advance," Admiral Thrackness ordered. "Destroy the enemy vessel and secure the gate." Jake watched the enemy fleet approach on his tactical display. 12 massive dreadnoughts, 48 cruisers, and over 200 fighters. One modified training ship with a crew of troublemakers and rule breakers. "They're taking the bait," Lisa reported from her communication station. "All enemy forces are converging on our position." "Perfect," Jake replied. "Now let's show them what chaos looks like." The UES Defiance didn't fight like any ship in galactic military databases. Instead of maintaining formation and exchanging fire at long range, it darted between enemy vessels, like an angry insect. It attacked from unexpected angles, used asteroids and debris as cover, and ignored every principle of space combat that the hegemony had ever studied. But the real surprise came when Admiral Thrackness tried to surround the lone enemy ship. His perfectly coordinated fleet moved into an optimal encirclement pattern, only to discover that the empty system wasn't empty at all. The retreating ships from previous battles hadn't really retreated. The misdirected supply convoys hadn't really gotten lost. The malfunctioning units hadn't really malfunctioned. They had all been repositioning themselves for this moment. Suddenly, hegemony forces found themselves surrounded by enemies that appeared from behind asteroids, emerged from planetary rings, and decloaked in positions that should have been impossible to reach undetected. "Impossible," Admiral Thrackness muttered as his tactical display lit up with hostile contacts. "Our sensors showed no enemy forces in this system." "That's because you were looking for enemy forces that behave like you do," Jake broadcast on an open channel. "We don't behave like you do." The battle that followed broke every rule of space warfare that had been written over the past 3,000 years. Jake's forces didn't maintain formation. They swarmed. They didn't engage in orderly exchanges of fire. They struck and vanished. They didn't follow predictable patterns. They improvised constantly. The hegemony fleet, designed to fight enemies that followed established doctrine, had no response to tactics that ignored doctrine entirely. Their perfect formations became liabilities when the enemy refused to engage them properly. Their superior firepower was useless against opponents who wouldn't stay still long enough to be targeted. Within 6 hours, Admiral Thrackness was forced to order a retreat. Half his fleet was disabled or destroyed, and the remainder was scattered across 3 star systems. The Battle of Kepler's Gate became the first major hegemony defeat in over 50 years. But Jake wasn't finished. The victory at Kepler's Gate was just the beginning of Operation Wildcard. Over the next 2 weeks, his unconventional warfare units began appearing throughout hegemony territory, striking at targets that traditional military wisdom said were impossible to reach. Supply depots that had been considered absolutely secure were raided by forces that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Communication networks were disrupted by tactics that didn't exist in any military manual. Hegemony commanders found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The psychological effect was devastating. Hegemony soldiers, trained to rely on predictable patterns and established procedures, began to doubt everything they had been taught. How do you fight an enemy that doesn't follow any recognizable rules? Admiral Thrackness requested emergency reinforcements from the Hegemony core worlds. His reports described an enemy that used impossible tactics and chaotic warfare methods that their forces couldn't counter. The Hegemony High Command's response was swift and massive. They deployed their entire reserve fleet, over 300 ships carrying the most experienced officers and elite troops in their empire. If these mysterious human tactics worked against regular forces, they would overwhelm them with overwhelming superiority. The surrender broadcast reached every corner of the galaxy within hours. Admiral Thrackness stood before the assembled representatives of 17 species, his proud Hegemony uniform torn and stained from weeks of desperate fighting. The words he spoke would change how every civilization viewed warfare for generations to come. "We surrender unconditionally to the forces of the Galactic Alliance," Admiral Thrackness announced, his voice heavy with defeat. "However, we wish to make it clear that we are not surrendering to your traditional forces, your established doctrines, or your honored way of war. We surrender to the humans and to the terrible possibility they represent." Jake Morrison watched. The broadcast from his new command ship, the U.S. Pandora. The vessel had been built specifically for his unconventional warfare division, designed by engineers who threw out every rule of ship construction they had ever learned. It looked strange, moved unpredictably, and carried weapons that didn't exist in any military manual. "The humans don't think like us," Admiral Thrackness continued. "They don't move like us. They don't fight like us. They have introduced chaos into a universe of order, and we cannot adapt fast enough to survive it." Around Jake, his command crew listened to the surrender with mixed emotions. Ryan Brooks looked proud but worried. Lisa Park seemed amazed that their small team had brought down an entire empire. Yathara's tentacles curled with what Jake had learned to recognize as excitement mixed with fear. Even Torvak, the Krillian warrior who had once criticized Jake's methods, appeared troubled by their victory. "Is this what we wanted?" he asked quietly. "To be feared throughout the galaxy?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about how far they had come from that first day when Commander Veltar had called him a problem cadet. The academy that had tried to expel him now hosted delegations from dozens of species, all wanting to understand how humans fought. Every species that has encountered humanity in warfare has faced the same choice. Admiral Thrackness continued his broadcast. "Adapt to their chaos or be consumed by it. The age of predictable warfare is over." The broadcast ended, but its effects were immediate. Within days, Jake received communication requests from military leaders across the galaxy. Some wanted to learn human tactics. Others wanted to hire human advisors. A few made it clear they were considering whether humanity itself had become too dangerous to tolerate. Admiral Corthes summoned Jake to a meeting that included representatives from the Galactic Defense Council. The conference room was filled with the most powerful military minds in known space, all staring at the young human who had somehow changed everything. "Lieutenant Morrison," Admiral Corthes began, "your methods have proven effective beyond our wildest expectations. The Hegemony War ended in 3 weeks instead of the predicted 3 years. Casualties were minimal on our side. By every measure, Operation Wildcard was a complete success." Jake sensed there was a but coming. "Thank you, sir. However," the Admiral continued, "your success has created new problems. Several species are demanding that human military tactics be regulated or banned entirely. They argue that chaos-based warfare threatens the stability that has kept peace in this galaxy." General Vorthus of the Krillian High Command leaned forward. "Some are even suggesting that humanity should be quarantined until we can determine whether your species represents a threat to galactic civilization." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had expected criticism, but not calls for quarantine. "Sir, we only used these tactics against enemies who attacked first. We've never initiated hostilities with anyone." "That may be true," Admiral Corthus replied, "but fear is not always logical. The galaxy has spent thousands of years developing systems based on predictability. Your methods threaten those systems in ways we're still trying to understand." Commander Veltar, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "Perhaps we should have expelled you when we had the chance, Morrison. At least then the galaxy would still make sense." Jake stood up slowly. He looked around the room, at the faces of beings who had once respected him as a fellow soldier, but now saw him as something dangerous and unpredictable. "With respect, sir, the galaxy stopped making sense long before I arrived. You've all been playing the same game for so long that you forgot it was just a game. Real warfare isn't about following rules. It's about survival. And what happens when everyone starts thinking like you?" General Vorthas challenged. "What happens when chaos becomes the new order?" Jake thought about that question for a long moment. Then maybe the galaxy will finally be ready for whatever's coming next. The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but Jake understood that everything had changed. He was no longer just a successful officer. He had become a symbol of something that frightened the established order. 3 months later, the consequences of that fear became clear. The collective of Zerion, a peaceful confederation of scientific worlds, made an official request to the Galactic Council. They wanted humanity removed from all military positions and restricted to their home system. The human approach to conflict represents an existential threat to civilized society, their ambassador declared during the emergency session. If chaos becomes an acceptable military doctrine, it will inevitably spread to other areas of governance and social organization. The debate that followed split the galaxy into two camps. Species that had been helped by human interventions defended their right to serve. Species that feared unpredictability demanded restrictions. The Galactic Council was deadlocked. Jake found himself at the center of a political crisis he had never intended to create. His unconventional warfare division was disbanded pending the Council's decision. His ships were confined to port. His methods were studied by analysts who treated them like a dangerous disease that needed to be contained. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had been trying to help the galaxy defend itself, but his success had made him the enemy. The final confrontation came when the Void Hunters, the same raiders Jake had first encountered at New Thessia, launched their largest offensive in history. They had been watching the galactic debates about human tactics, and they had decided to strike while the defenders were arguing among themselves. The attack was massive and coordinated. Instead of their usual hit-and-run raids, the Void Hunters deployed entire fleets against multiple targets simultaneously. They had learned from the hegemony's defeat and adapted their own tactics to counter traditional galactic responses. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed that the galaxy would respond with traditional tactics because the humans had been sidelined. Admiral Corthus found Jake in his quarters on the Academy station, staring out at the stars where distant explosions marked the locations of burning worlds. "We need your help," the Admiral said without preamble. "The Void Hunters are using modified versions of your chaos tactics. Our traditional forces can't counter them." Jake turned to face the Admiral. "I thought I was too dangerous to be trusted with military operations." "You are," Admiral Corthus admitted. "But right now, dangerous is exactly what we need." Jake's response was immediate. "My team and I are ready, sir. But this time, we do things our way from the beginning. No committee oversight. No tactical review boards. No second guessing." The Admiral nodded grimly. "Agreed. The galaxy will have to trust you completely, or lose everything to enemies who learn to think like you." The final battle against the Void Hunters took place across 7 star systems simultaneously. Jake's forces, reunited and reinforced with volunteers from every species that had ever benefited from human intervention, deployed tactics that made their previous operations look conservative. They didn't just break the rules of warfare, they rewrote them entirely. Ships appeared in impossible locations. Attacks came from directions that shouldn't have existed. Enemy communications were hijacked and used to spread confusion through their own ranks. The Void Hunters, who had thought they understood chaos, discovered they had only scratched the surface. True chaos wasn't just unpredictability. It was the ability to create order from disorder, to find patterns in apparent randomness, to turn confusion into clarity. When the last Void Hunter ship fled into deep space, Jake stood once again in his command center. But this time he wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about the message he had received an hour earlier from long-range sensors. Something was coming from beyond the galactic rim, something that moved in patterns no one recognized, using technology that didn't match any known civilization. The scouts who had detected it were calling it the Unknown Fleet, but Jake suspected it was something much more significant. The galaxy had learned to fear human chaos, but chaos might be exactly what they needed to face whatever was approaching. Jake looked around at his mixed crew of humans and aliens who had learned to think like humans. They had become something new, not quite human, not quite alien, but something adapted to survive in a universe that didn't follow any rules. "Sir," Lisa Park called from her communication station, "we're receiving priority messages from across the galaxy. Every species wants to know if we're ready to face this new threat." Jake smiled for the first time in months. The galaxy that had feared him was now turning to him for protection.